led me to understand and think about the paradigm. And I started thinking about paradigm change, and it led me to Jeremy Rifkin. And that was previous to understanding Bill Black, that there was a big disconnect. I kept thinking in my own terms about the New Green Deal back in 2011, but I couldn't quite formulate what that meant. And as I continued to scratch the surface, I came across Bill Black, who suddenly made everything make sense. Everything actually had a point, but we didn't know exactly to what ends until we started actually getting out on the road and talking to everybody that was a part of the system. We met whistleblowers at every step of the way who were so courageous that told the truth that the way I was starting to develop this kind of vision of what I was interpreting was, wait a second, this whole thing was designed. And then it was covered up. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the great financial crisis that led to the most massive transfer of wealth in our lifetimes, possibly history. And they started scratching the numbers, started talking to experts, and so on and so forth. And at first, like most lay people, I was thinking, okay, well, there was HAMP, there was TARP, there were all these emergency programs. I didn't exactly understand what they were all about. But then we started talking to people who were on the inside, and we started getting to understand the real figures. And the real figures were so exponential. It was like, how is this possible? That nobody's talking about what caused the greatest transfer of wealth in our lifetimes, possibly history. And as it turns out, it was a giant crime syndicate. So we were able to figure out, and it's really pretty much, I think, the core of everything I've been hearing here for the last 12 hours, which is extraordinary. And I hope that we can play some small role as a puzzle to create the domino to the general population that will finally understand actually what happened so that we can get to what needs to happen. And on that note, I want to introduce my colleague and my partner and friend, our director, Eric Vaughn, who will fill in blanks with them.
Just really briefly, just talk a little bit about what you're about to see here. So my main goal was to put a human face on the financial crisis and to give people a means of understanding that was different from a lot of the other documentaries in the space that were talking about the financial crisis. So we decided to wrap this in much more of a narrative type of tale where we're kind of taking a lot of elements from true crime documentary and so on, and then displaying what we discovered in our research in that mode. And so without speaking too much else about it, better to just go ahead and watch it. So.
And one last thing I do want to mention before we do play this is our intent to come here was to hopefully connect with everybody to be able to pollinate this to get out there, because we do think this is one of the key dominoes that can help bring the general population. And by the way, this will have a national release.
We probably been to Abby Polk's house 5 to 6 times.
And each time delivered notices of home life.
Yes.
The bankers could give her more time. You know, her husband had passed away, she was a widow, trying to keep her home. Imagine, just wanting to live their last days in their home.
All I could think was, dear God, she had done everything that she felt that she could do.
We had a huge case, but the bottom line is that we didn't do anything but touch the tip of an iceberg.
My 401k, my bank account, my car, I had to get rid of that to pay for the mortgage.
It was either we eat or pay the mortgage. It sucks that I have to put this kid through this.
This was money chasing people. This was not somebody looking for a loan. This was money went on the street looking for people.
You said, how many times did you change documentation on paperwork to make the loan application fit so that it would be approved? And the guy looked right at us and said, I don't know, maybe 200 times.
Everything was incentivized by the commission. If I didn't do it, the guy down the street was, and there's $4,500 out of my commission that he just took.
Remember the American Reform? The art department was where they would either do tracings or they would create documents. You would go in there and you could smell the light. So there was clear fraud involved in American scams.
And finally I said, what criteria do you use in determining if somebody should get a loan. And they said, if they could follow the mirror, we'll give them a loan. This was a criminal enterprise. It wasn't business.
We're trying to figure out why in the world would somebody be going door to door trying to originate loans for $100,000 in a house that anybody who lived in the neighborhood would know was worth $20,000 or $15,000. And the reason was there was such an incredible demand on Wall Street for those loans. They were mortgage-backed security salesmen, and the way their bonus was set was how much revenue that they generated based on selling this crap.
We're talking about 70 billion every year of fraudulent stuff being pumped out and sold by Citigroup.
They're selling to their very clients these loans that they know are disasters.
This stress from this, Kelton. They put our money in investments that they knew that there would be a huge loss. No one asks to see your life savings stolen.
It's kind of hard to believe. You're watching this stuff going on and you're thinking, don't these guys know that this is going to be a calamity for the country?
The stock market is now down 21%. Traders say this is the craziest thing they have ever seen in these markets.
They did, but they didn't care because they got the money.
This whole system is a rigged system. The only people who were not in on it were the pension funds, and the other end, the homeowners, they're the ones who got screwed.
Those companies preyed on not just the people, but they preyed on the circumstances the people were in.
Addie Polk was a prime example of what predatory lending was doing to people.
The idea of being homeless. Here I am, 97 years old, always had a home, my husband provided for me. And all of a sudden, I'm outdoors. And I think it was just too much.
This financial crisis didn't happen without a boatload of criminal activity. People at every level of Wall Street made that happen. And we prosecuted none of them.
I mean, how is it possible that banks could engage in such massive misconduct that no bankers were involved? You created the mess we're in. I cannot believe no one's prosecuted you on this.
The major federal regulators were funded by the institutions that they supervised.
So they were competing for the bank's business. And how were they competing for the bank's business? By telling them that they weren't going to regulate it.
The investigation was suppressed. We never questioned anybody above the level of the trading desk.
They basically buried my testimony. And as it turns out, they not only buried it, they locked it up. The SEC has continued to refuse to release any of the 1,000 pages of documents that I gave to them.
We owed it to the American people to at least right the ship in some way, prosecute these people. And we let them down.
Jamie Dimon, instead of getting a perk walk, was invited to the White House 22 times between 2009 and 2013 alone.
The American public blames the elite, the people in charge, the politicians, CEOs, and they're right. In general, that's what you should find, the people who are in charge.
Their settlements, the billions that banks paid out, was the price that they were willing to pay for keeping secret what really happened.
This is the largest conspiracy of lies in the history of the world.
I just don't feel that this country should be so quick to judge without knowing the facts.
I think we're headed for a very, very bad place.
There's another crisis coming.
We've got to wake this public up as to what's going on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bernal. I'm a lecturer at CUNY Queens College in Urban Studies, a doctoral student at the New School in Public and Urban Policy, research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and a visiting scholar at the University of Missouri Kansas City Department of Economics. I'm also a policy advisor who's worked with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and more recently with Jessica Cisneros for Congress in Texas 28. Yeah. So it's my pleasure to be here with all of you, moderating this next wonderful panel that we have. But before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to mention a few things about MMT in the public sphere, and begin by talking a little bit about the public sphere, and more specifically, the public. I think one of the most important lessons that I took from yesterday, that I think is just fundamental to the work that MMT does and the message that we offer, is reminding ourselves that there is no independent world out there where markets sort of just exist naturally and emerge as do corporations and whatnot, but rather everything begins with the public. In fact, to just be is to encounter one another, and to live socially is to be in the public. And it's that when we begin to order and organize our space and our social relations, that we bring about the different demarcations and separations that create this understanding that there's a public world and a private world. In fact, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas talked about the life world as being at the core of the sense of the public. His notion of the life world talked about a sort of background conditions of people with needs, with thoughts, and with different capabilities, including the capacity to communicate to one another. He separated this idea of the life world from what he called the system, which was the market economy and the state apparatus, which was mediated by communicated language and the human imagination. So essentially, the public sphere, what is it, right? Well, it's made up of different social agents that are gathered together as the public and articulating the needs of society with and engaging with the state. So for me, reclaiming our money and building public power means engaging in the public sphere of thought and the interdependencies that relies on, while rejecting the logic that there is simply a marketplace of ideas. So it's been my blessing to, over the last years in particular, to witness kind of the evolution of MMT in different forms, from the way that we have engaged the debate about public spending, from AOC's introduction of very important ideas into the media, to Senate Republicans introducing a resolution against MMT, and of course the infamous Twitter wars between some of our thinkers and advocates and figures like Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, and others. So I'd like to begin now by introducing our panel. Bill Black is an associate professor in economics at the University of Missouri Kansas City. He's a white-collar criminologist, former financial regulator, and author of The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. Pavlina Tcherneva is an associate professor and director of the economics program at Bard College. Her research on the jobs guarantee has informed several proposals from many members of Congress and has been instrumental in the current discussion on the jobs guarantee program. Scott Fullwiler is a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and assistant professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, previously held the James E. A. Leach Endowed Chair in Banking and Monetary Economics, and is the social entrepreneurship program co-director at Wartburg College in Waverly, Iowa. Associate professor. Yes. Even better. And then we have with us, of course, Stephanie Kelton, and we weren't sure if she was going to be able to make it today, so we're very happy that she's here with us. Stephanie Kelton, the professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University. She was chief economist on the 2015 U.S. Senate Budget Committee, Minority Party staff, and senior advisor to presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. So let's hear it for our panelists.
I'll come up here. First, thanks
usual, it's a ritual, the organizers, but actually this has been extraordinary, and you are all part of making it extraordinary. Thank you for putting this all together. Let me start with what you saw a bit. You saw one of the top enforcement attorneys at the Securities and Exchange Commission. You saw one of the 4 top Justice Department attorneys that do elite fraud cases. You didn't see, but he's in it, the top guy at the FBI. Lean in more. All of these people have come forward to be in this documentary because they are so furious at the refusal of the people at the absolute top of the U.S. government to prosecute. And they are personally offended that they failed the nation, not because of any defect in themselves, but because there was nothing they could do. You also saw 2 of my fellow co-founders of Bank Whistleblowers United. One is the most senior whistleblower at Citi, the other at Countrywide. Together, they gave both the SEC and the Department of Justice on a platinum platter cases against these CEOs. One, I will remind you, Robert Rubin as well. And the Justice Department and the SEC refused to take action even when they got it on an absolute platter. And both of those individuals did absolutely the right thing, proved that they were substantively right, followed the instructions that were supposed to guide their behavior. Had they been listened to, would have saved their institutions hundreds of millions of dollars, and never sought to be whistleblowers. And for that sin, they are unemployed and unemployable everywhere in finance 11 years later. Now think, infer what that means for the finance industry of the United States of America. That not a single bank will hire people who did absolutely the right thing and demonstrated enormous courage and morality. That's the state of the financial institution. That is actually the best way to judge it. All right, so I bring lots of hats. You heard a bunch of them, but I've actually been a banker and on credit committees and all the good types of things. And I'm a serial whistleblower. Okay, I recommend. How many people have read Field's work on this? So, good. Worth the price of admission. Okay, so Field makes the point. You know what we don't do? We don't do prevention. What we do after the fact is helicopter money measured in the tens of trillions of dollars, and GDP losses, as we'll see, measured in the many tens of trillions of dollars. This is insane. It does not have to be this way. How should we be looked at? What face do we want to be giving to the world, to the media, to other economists? The people that are in the prevention business is one of my suggestions, as opposed to, after it happens, we come along and figure out not the best way, but the fastest way of making bankers rich. Right? And what was the myth in 2007? We have the best financial system in the whole world, and it's all great. Okay, so we, as conventional economists, cannot even figure out when we are on the brink of catastrophe, where the housing bubble has already burst, that maybe things are a bit wrong in the system. Especially because, hey, we've got experience. We had this thing called the savings and loan crisis. We could, next thing we would have in our public face, we could learn lessons. God forbid. And one of them we could learn was that fraud became omnipresent. at the worst failures in the savings and loan debacle. Well, maybe we should stop that, because fraud is unambiguously bad for the world, and it costs a whole lot of money. But what did economists do instead? Field is no, progressive type. He's a moderate conservative type. He says they went out of their way to minimize the role of fraud, which again, that word, omnipresent at the worst failures. Why in God's name would you do something like that unless you wanted a really catastrophically bad policy? Well, how much did it cost us? The great financial crisis, you're going to hear me say, is a reprise. Indeed, it is the third act of the savings and loan debacle. It is the same fraud mechanisms. It is even the same major player, Ameriquest, which simply changed its name between the two crises and became the model for all of this. And the cost, and therefore, in this discussion of how can we possibly pay for things, was $41.7 trillion in lost GDP present value in 2009 dollars. Okay? Now, did anybody get asked, hi, can we spend $41.7 trillion or give up $41.7 trillion? We have a vote on that? Now, the numbers what we can't afford is stupidity. And this is stupidity. When we've seen a disaster before, we know it produces a disaster, and we sit and do nothing for 14 years, in this case, as a massive bubbled series of fraud epidemics grow. Can we do better? Well, yes. You heard Bill in the first major talk say that he's been laboring at this for 25 years, right? Well, on the micro side of MMT, the micro foundations, it's now 1984, 16 plus 19, that's 35 years that we've been laboring. And because, God forbid, they made this terrible mistake once and allowed us in power, we actually do have successes, right? In this realm. Enormous successes, amazing successes, which is, of course, why they make sure we're not in those positions of power at the present time. And one of them was when we inherited massive epidemic of fraud, 300 institutions, each of them fraudulent, each of them growing more than 50% a year. Many of them growing more than 1,000% a year. We were able to stop it, and with having no significant recession. Indeed, savings and loan profitability increased under this time period. It's actually good for the honest people in the industry not to have to compete with the frauds. We actually make the economy more effective by stopping fraud, not the other way around. And so, okay, this hurts our Midwestern souls, but we actually have studied this point. Liar's loans began, as do all good financial frauds, in Orange County, California. And they began in 1990, and our examiners, who were overwhelmed dealing with the biggest part of the savings and loan crisis, which was commercial real estate, spotted the problem almost immediately, and got in our faces and said, you've got to stop this stuff. They're not verifying the borrower's income. That has to lead to fraud, that has to lead to disaster, right? And so we went and we actually pushed all of them out. And the last to go deliberately gave up federal deposit insurance, deliberately gave up its federal charter for the sole purpose of escaping our jurisdiction, because they knew they were the last hit that was going to go into the basket, right? In these circumstances. They became a mortgage bank. In other words, a shadow financial sector, where we would no longer have any jurisdiction for the sole purpose of escaping us. And then they became the model for what came next. So how bad was the problem in liar's loans? Oh, Yeah. 70% of the total losses. So almost everything you've been taught, even if you worked really hard about the great financial crisis, is a myth. And if you've been taught by neoclassical economists, 100% of what is a myth, right? Why? Because Herndon, so people know who he is? What did he do great first? Yes, on? Yes, so this guy should be a hero to us all. He's had an amazing track record as a young economist. He actually asked the question, hey, you know, it's not simply how many loans default, it's how much of the loss they produce when they default. So he was the first to look at that. And that's where the 70% figure came from. And it isn't simply a loss. The reason that film focuses on adding hope, focuses on predation, is first, because conventional economists ignore it still, but second, because the true obscenity of the great financial crisis was to take the greatest victims, as the Reverend said in the prior panel, and blame them for the crisis when they were the principal victim. This is obscene. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, one of the most conservative group of economists in the world, Austrians, many of them. Median wealth declined by about 72% among Hispanic college grad families versus a decline of only, 41% among Hispanic families without a college degree. Among blacks, declines were 60% versus 37%. In other words, yes, the great financial crisis was a catastrophe for the vast bulk of Americans. But we cannot ignore the fact that it was a crisis aimed at subgroups of Americans, and where the principal damage, 3 generations of wealth accumulated, grandparents, parents, kids, were wiped out in a few weeks by these frauds. And when you bring someone in to buy a home through appraisal fraud, which comes almost exclusively from lenders, then they think, oh, I'm safe. The home's worth $100,000. Look, this appraiser has said that. And it's actually worth, whatever, $20,000 to $40,000. There is no conceivable way that can end in anything but disaster for the community. And we know, we have statistics from New Century, one of the worst of the predators, that they succeeded in predation almost exactly half of the time. So they had an extraordinarily effective pitch to destroy people's wealth. And they aimed at particular people. Well, how much of this was there? Not episodic, a systematic abandonment of the process. I can't possibly at the time, but many of you have heard the fraud recipe stuff. Please read it if you're interested. And I swear that these folks do not do this out of a sense of irony. They're finance profs, they have no sense of humor. All reputable intermediaries involved in the sale of mortgages were engaged in systematic misrepresentation. Got that? All of them were engaged in fraud, and what does the author call the persons, these entities? What would happen if any of us did this? So we systematically cheated at people left, right, and center. Would we be called reputable? Yeah, probably not so much, right? Okay. I think by time, am I dead on that? I did. Go ahead. Okay. Yay. Can't believe it. Okay, you have seen the ability of whistleblowers to cause immense change in short time periods because we just had a real world experiment, right? In the political world. That's actually important also, I would argue, in terms of how we want to be seen and how we should approach economics. Whistleblowers and investigations are by far the best source of economic data in a vast range of the most important activities. And they are never taught in a standard course, in a neoclassical program. You're taught how to do regressions and such, but the fact where you get actual evidence, which by the way is that the data that went into the regressions was absolutely nonsense, because remember that systematic bias? What does systematic bias do to the validity of statistical tests? Yeah. Right, so it produces entities that are guaranteed to report massive profits while they in fact are massively insolvent. And it also means that the world is this is one of the sources of why the economic world is so non-linear. And neoclassical economics is immensely linear, right? They cannot analyze major changes under their models because they can't exist under their models. We should be open to this and to the fact that life, in fact, is immensely nonlinear, and therefore you can have someone who's a reasonably intelligent neoclassical economist, an expert in his field, say in late 2007, our banking industry is A-OK, great, the model for the world, and such, right? They're not a little bit wrong. If you know Yiddish, they're smart blind. If you obviously know, that means really lost. And you can tell how much corporate power and political power fears us. Because when do they go absolutely berserk? It's when there's a whistleblower. When the President of the United States, in front of a bunch of State Department folks with their kids, starts talking about how it was great in the old days when he could execute them. Their parents, mind you. Right? That's our President of the United States. That kind of truly, just beyond belief, mishigas, only comes because they fear these kinds of disclosures so much. Okay. And I know this. We really, really, really drive people crazy because we don't play the game. Right? And that also should be our face. We don't play the game. We don't bullshit you. We don't hem and haw. We actually have a human conversation and we explain to the best of our abilities the nature of the problem. And when that problem is really, really severe, we say it is. And you can see that in the silence. By the way, the Attorney General of the United States, for decades, has hated whistleblowers with a purple passion. This is one of the reasons Bush, it's Trump, I guess, appointed him, right? He said we were, and I quote, an abomination. That we were doing this only to make money. He quoted favorably that we were viperous vermin, which is at least a liberty. We are a threat to the liberties of the American people. We are a devastating threat to the executive's constitutional authority and grave danger to the president. Well, hell, then he was right about that. Okay? Oh, yeah. The other ones like to compare us to Judas. And we're tattletales, so we're in like 4-year-olds who run the mom or dad, tell about the big brother. And we got authors in print saying that the reason people blow the whistle is to try to cripple
Trump not to protect the nation as such. And that pity, who should our pity go to? The poor banks that were assaulted, where not a single banker, major banker was convicted or even tried, but they had to pay some fines. Okay. In contrast to what we do, you may still harbor some ideas, if you're not an academic, that, you know, maybe these other folks are rigorous, you know, scientific. They got fancy models to do math. Okay, this is one of the leading explainers of modern macro. Super neoclassical right. He's the research director at the Richmond Fed. Kartik Akstram. Modern macroeconomics is almost, but not perfectly dystopian. It remains maximally cynical about the behavior of people and the corporations they run. So that should be easy, right? It sounds like us. Corporations, big problems, cause all kinds of stuff. And we should not deify markets, right? But, you know, there's actually this silent assumption. Why is it silent, anybody? Because it dare not speak its pain. Right? A silent assumption of the core model of the micro foundations of modern macro is, and I quote, there is an ADM God. There is a God of laissez-faire devoted to making their models work. Now, what would happen if any of us published an article in which we dropped the footnote and explained, footnote, we're depending on the MMT God? This is the supposed science. It is implicit, because we dare not say it explicitly. Law enforcement is so perfect in punishment of the God, mind you. They at least got this part right. Their God would be vicious. That no one will ever do anything wrong. Firms will do everything right. Everything is going to be great. Coach Lakota, who is from this community, but has a slide, and I'll end on this. He has a great sense of humor. Almost coincidentally, we'll stress almost, in these models, all government interventions, including all forms of stabilization policy, are undesirable. I wonder how that could happen. Thank you.
Prevention and predation.
Yes.
I like those two words. Okay, so that's how I want to start my talk. Prevention and predation. Now, prevention and predation. Oh my goodness, we really have to get used to those two words. Because MMT is engaged in a project of not just debunking myths about money, but also we engage in a project of re-envisioning the future. And so what we're doing is, as like a house of cards, once you bust one myth, then the rest of them topple. But what we should keep in mind is the way the system functions today. And the system seems to function on maintaining predation, maintaining neglect, maintaining extraction, environmental destruction, poverty and unemployment, fraudulent activity, and on it goes. And so predation seems to infiltrate virtually all aspects of our economic life. And as we illuminate some of the new lessons of MMT and the kind of directions in which it can lead us, we are actually engaged in a project of rehabilitation. We have so much curing to do. We have so much damage to mend. And we really want to move beyond this world. We want to move to a world that is good, that is sustainable, that is prosperous. And so down the line, at least where I see the conversation go, is that at one point, once we get there, we have to talk about prevention and preserving that world. So how close have we come? Have we inched just a little bit to this this project in the last year. So I want to talk in very specific terms what has happened, transpired in the last year in the public sphere, and where we might move the conversation forward. MMT has really forced the mainstream to reckon with some of our ideas, and I do mean force, because the MMT implications are devastating for the classical thought, and we have noticed some movement around the NAIRU and around fiscal policy. So let's take an assessment there. And then we will do a bit of an assessment of the role of the job guarantee in the broader conversation, specifically in the context of the Green New Deal, as well as I'd like to address the issue of the job guarantee and unpaid caregivers. It's a question that constantly comes up, and I'd like us to flesh out ways of thinking about the relationship between the job guarantee and unpaid care work. Okay, so my favorite quote from this year, 2019, Jay Powell early in the AA conference when he said that we have to find the natural rate of unemployment. We need this concept. We need to know whether unemployment is too high, too low, or just right. And a few months later, he had to go in front of Congress and say, well, you know what, we really have no idea. The relationship between unemployment and inflation has gone away, but at the end of the day, there has to be a connection, because employment will drive wages, God forbid, and ultimately higher wages will drive inflation. So what is happening in the mainstream conversation? There is a deep rethinking of the NAIRU concept. We are not offering the brand new critique of the NAIRU. There has been a long tradition, intellectual tradition of critique of the NAIRU, but we are adding new fire to this critique. And I think we have driven a lot of the conversation in terms of how shall we think about inflation, and should unemployment be the bulwark? And to that end, I think the mainstream is feeling the pressure and saying, okay, well, the NAIRU relationship is falling apart. We do need it nevertheless. So we are living in a paradigm that we are insisting on unemployment. So I think the MMT project is not just, it's very important that we articulate an alternative stabilizer that does not depend on unemployment, but that conception should not be contingent on us debunking the NAIRU. Because the mainstream will be very happy to give up the NAIRU and still insist on the necessity of unemployment. And I think we need to drive a stake through the heart of this consensus, tacit consensus, that unemployment is necessary and maybe even necessary to maintain low wages. Right? We really have to reject that frame that unemployment is necessary, that it is natural, that it is unavoidable. And to that end, I think we are succeeding in saying that it's not necessary for price stabilization because we have an alternative. I mean, the Fed has already said they don't have reliable theory of inflation. The NAIRU is a myth, so what are we doing? And what if we had a benevolent Fed? What if Sean and Adi succeeded and the Fed said, well, you're right, we will tackle the monster of unemployment, not the little, non-existent inflation problem. What can they do? What can we ask them to do, right? And I think, there's not very much except maybe to ask them to step aside, not step on the brakes of the economy when the economy is perceived to be doing well. And there is, again, a recognition even amongst the maestros, right, the monetary authority leaders, that much more responsibility must be placed on fiscal policy. Okay, so, but then I share the same fear that Bill shared yesterday, that we might be resurrecting bastard Keynesian policy. There is now great interest in automatic stabilizers, or fortifying them. Well, every fiscal policy has an automatic feature, right? Fiscal policy by necessity is counter-cyclical. Policies that deal with economic insecurity are by necessity counter-cyclical. And so, yeah, we can strengthen and fortify them, and we can do all these wonderful things of unemployment insurance, nutrition assistance, basic temporary assistance, fortify all of those. But those are still policies that reside within an unemployment paradigm. So whenever you hear a wonderful project proposal, I think the natural response should be, if it lacks the job guarantee, why do you advocate for a policy response that needs or requires the existence of unemployment? And the job guarantee is the only alternative. So we are looking to replace the unemployment regime with a jobs for all regime. We're looking to replace the unemployment stabilizers with full employment stabilizers. And there's a long way to go, I think, in terms of clearly rethinking fiscal policy from the ground up, as the mainstream grapples with some of, with their newfound love for fiscal policy. MMT has to be at the forefront to push to rethink traditional fiscal policies and push for policies that are rooted in the context of guaranteeing economic rights and providing alternative economic stabilizers. Okay, and then there have been some developments, obviously, in the job guarantee front. The place where the mainstream hasn't been kicking and screaming and adopting the MMT has been the Green New Deal conversation. And again, that conversation is not exactly driven by the mainstream. It is driven by a community that has been traditionally outside of the mainstream, which explains why it has been such a natural marriage between the job guarantee and the Green New Deal. It was almost unquestioned that the job guarantee will be a key component of the Green New Deal because it embeds social justice in the climate response. So we have found a home in that community, but I want to say that the job guarantee has always been green, right? Even before the Green New Deal, the job guarantee has always thought about conservation, about care, and which is really one of the reasons why we have a natural home in this project. But the job guarantee is also a job guarantee plus. It resides within a broader network or a broader framework of policies for economic security. And so, what is the plus? Let's talk a little bit about the plus. The job guarantee within our work has been always the alternative macroeconomic stabilizer, the price anchor. It has been the Naira alternative and a cornerstone for the economic rights. That we can't quite fully secure all of our economic rights unless we also secure this one vital piece, the access to a living wage job. The plus deals with the broader safety net. And so I want to, again, appeal to you to resist the urge to sell it as a panacea to all social ills. And I know this happens a lot, especially when we are debating our UBI adversaries. I've been doing this for such a long time. We are so talking past each other. Like these two policies are always pitted as alternatives to each other. And I will spend many hours critiquing the universal basic income, but not as an alternative to the job guarantee. Or the job guarantee, yes. Or the job guarantee does fulfill a lot of the objectives of the UBI, but it certainly is not a panacea to all sorts of social problems. So we are talking past each other, number one. Number two, there are other anti-inflationary pressures, and so the job guarantee plus means that we need to be tackling other inflation pressures in other ways, so let's resist the urge of selling it as a panacea to all forms of inflation. Oh, wait, there's something else there. So the job guarantee has been called the most crucial aspect of the Green New Deal. How should we understand its role? When you listen to the climate discourse, the word guarantee is tossed around a lot. I think it's useful to, at least in our minds, develop a taxonomy of what all these guarantees are in the climate response. So the first one is, so we need to figure out the type of purpose, like what kind of purpose are these guarantees fulfilling? The first one is in the context of the broader socialization of investment. I think that's what we're hearing a lot today, right? We're talking about big, bold mobilization effort that is necessary to transform the economy away from fossil fuels, stabilize emissions, etc. Right? We're talking about all hands on deck kind of policy. And so this kind of guarantee is a guarantee to people that they will have a place, ability to participate in that greening process, and it will require all manner of skill, technological know-how, all manner of expertise. So this is really pertaining to the industrial strategy of the Green New Deal. Then there are other guarantees that you will find in, for example, Senator Sanders' proposal. In the context of this broader socialization of investment, you probably have come across his argument that we will guarantee miners or fossil fuel workers wages, comparable wages in the green transformation, or we will be guaranteeing retirement income, early retirement, and generous disability, right? So this is the guarantee that we won't throw them under the bus, that we will do what's right. As we euthanize those jobs, we will ensure livelihood to those people. And those guarantees are both job guarantees and income guarantees, right? The retirement is essentially an income guarantee. The second and third use of the job guarantee in the Green New Deal discourse are the ones that we normally emphasize, right? We're talking about the safety net that will be there for the most vulnerable. You know, the dock workers, the people who are last fired, first hired, people who have most precarious work experience, and that they will need to be assured a transition, a safety net, a living wage safety net. And the final use of the job guarantee is, of course, the employment buffer stock, the one that we insist on, because that will be necessary even in a green world. We will not euthanize the business cycle by moving to a green economy. And we will still need to ensure that we do not use the unemployed to stabilize that green future. Okay, a few final words about unpaid care. And this really comes out of Andrew Wang's comment that I don't like Bernie. Why I don't like Bernie Sanders' job guarantee, because he doesn't like it because it does nothing for the caregiver. For his wife, who's taking care of 2 children, one of them is autistic, and the job guarantee does not help, and thus he does not like it. Okay, this is like saying, like, I don't like public education because I choose to homeschool my kids, right? Like, it's not an argument against, like, having an unpaid care burden, having important needs within the home that need to be attended to is not an argument against a policy that provisions living income in the paid sphere. They are completely separate things. Okay, so, all right, or like saying, let's not wipe out student debt because it does nothing for people who have medical debt, right? We have different purposes, we have different goals and policies to address different objectives. So, but it is decidedly not true that the job guarantee does nothing for the unpaid care person. That is not true, it needs to be articulated more clearly. Okay, first, we have always said that it is a job guarantee plus basic income for people who cannot, should not, will not work, right? And that also requires a rethinking of what kind of income support we will provide students, caregivers, others. Universal child allowance has been one way that we have advocated to support the person who cannot go to work, but there are other models. In the US, we have a program for caregivers for injured veterans. That could provide a model for parents that are attending to kids with autistic children or with severe needs. We can have various ways of looking at what is the unpaid care burden, what are the kind of specific needs families have to be able to allow them to thrive. But the job guarantee itself is care work. We conceptualize it as work that takes care of communities, that provides public goods that benefit families as a whole. So number one, we have a universal child care. So that helps with care burden for families who would like to work but are unable to work because they can't secure well-paid work, and thus they opt to stay at home. Okay, so we need to reckon with that. We can't assume everybody wants to be a caregiver in the home, right? And we need to reckon with the fact that when you survey caregivers, so you go on the Pew survey and you survey them, you find that people want to work. It's not because of the lack of income. There are many other reasons. So what the job guarantee does is it doesn't say everybody should work, but should you want to work, we will provide those options, and we will be providing family-friendly options. Maybe you like flexible hours, maybe you want part-time work. The other thing that is also very important is that caregivers experience very high obstacles to paid work. You may know the survey by Deborah Pager on former inmates who are applying for jobs that tend to face greater obstacles. African Americans without our criminal record face greater obstacles to paid work than white men with a criminal record. Okay? Now, the labor market is not a fair game, and it's not a fair game for caregivers either. There's a similar research that was done by someone at UNC, Kate Wetzer, and she finds that, she does a very similar survey, and she finds that stay-at-home parents are half as likely to get a call back as an unemployed parent, and a third as likely as employed parent. So it's better to be a parent and laid off than to be a parent who's been staying at home when you start, for some time, when you actually start looking for work. There's a penalty for staying at home. And so what the job guarantee does is it provides the safety net. If you have chosen, maybe the kids have fled the nest, right? Maybe you would like to take up some paid work. We remove that obstacle to paid work. We guarantee a living wage job option. So as we design policies to support unpaid caregivers, we want to reckon with the fact that caregiving is still predominantly a woman's job. It is predominantly, unpaid work is predominantly unequal and non-egalitarian. And much of this inequality is linked to the development of paid work in the post-industrial world and the development of the two spheres, the male paid sphere and the female care unpaid sphere. So we have to reckon with these path dependencies. In other words, if we want to support caregivers within the home, we want to think about policies that can make the distribution of the unpaid care burden a little more egalitarian. But we can't quite do that until we reckon with the fact that the paid options are not egalitarian. So how we deal with paid work will have material impacts on how we deal with unpaid work. Who gets the jobs? What kind of jobs? How well they are paid? I don't want to get into a discussion with UBI, but UBI doesn't quite address this. It has this lure of ease, this appeal of simplicity, and which I agree, it's so much easier to send people a check. But it does nothing to transform truly the power relationships within the home, because it explicitly rejects changing the power relationships in the workplace. And so, that's it. I just want to conclude there. We cannot divorce policy for unpaid caregivers from policies that make the labor market more egalitarian. The job guarantee is absolutely not a panacea to all of these complex, historically dependent problems, but it does level the playing field a bit. Thank you.
All right. It's definitely the cheesiest title I've ever done. It was a distant second to my first choice, but everybody told me I couldn't use my first choice. Anyway, that's all I should say about that one. I need the,
There you gotta tell us.
Okay, so outline. Don't at us with your MVP violence. Basically, because I couldn't fit the whole printing money on the line, so I just think that's printing money. Don't add us with your Phillips curve. Don't add us with your low unemployment rate. You like price controls and you cannot lie. I grew up in Seattle. New Walsh is from Seattle. Randy, some others from Seattle. So this is my Sir Mix-a-Lot homage here. Okay, sorry. Who comes first? That was like a delayed. Okay. Anyway, on printing money. No, I didn't put a tweet from me up there because I said it perfectly, et cetera, et cetera. It's because frequently when we do this sort of thing, people will accuse us of moving the goalposts. So I'm putting something up here that I did in May before this happened, anyway, so this was my tweet storm, whatever they call it now. From the very beginning, MMT has never argued that printing money was necessary. Anyone saying MMT was printing money, even if they correctly incorporate inflation constraint, is getting MMT wrong. Wait a minute, I'm going to go through the tweet storm just so you know. So these, let's see. The argument has always been the choice to issue bonds or not is about monetary policy and then setting a central bank's interest rate target, not whether to finance a deficit or print money. So whether or not the government issues bonds when it runs a deficit, the macroeconomic impact of bonds versus money is nil. That's always been the position. There were some proposals at times about not issuing bonds that had to do more with not subsidizing financial institutions with interest and so forth. That wasn't printing money necessarily the way that most people think of printing money. So I'm not going to put up here a bunch of MMT stuff showing we used to, we've said this all before. What I'm doing here is I'm going to show you some big name economists who are saying the same thing, so that when people say, oh, MMT, they should print money and that's hyperinflationary, blah, 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 you can say, well, yeah, but Paul Krugman said it's not hyperinflationary. Right? So, this is as I've tried to make, the point I'm trying to make, the relevance of the decision to finance budget deficits by printing money as opposed to selling bonds. Coach Lakota, which was referred to by Bill already, former Minneapolis Fed president. There's absolutely no difference between the two forms of financing. Read through that. The crucial point here is there's no need to employ a helicopter. Claudio Borio, he's probably, unless you're an economist, you probably heard of him. He's chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements. Anyway, he basically makes the same point. That it's equivalent to either debt or tax finance deficits, in which case it doesn't yield the desired additional expansionary effects. By that remaining sort of the jet fuel that's supposedly added if you run a deficit and print money. So, overarching point, it's the deficit that matters. It's the deficit that has the quantity effect. The way you finance it does not have the quantity effect. So, MMT is not advocating print money the way that most people think print money. MMT is saying it doesn't matter how you finance it. Okay. So, and just to show you that we did this, this is 2013. This was Stephanie and I doing a piece that was sort of an olive branch to Krugman's piece. And so we went through the T accounts and everything to explain what he was talking about and that he was right. Okay, so if I summarize this, deficits raise net financial assets and income of the private sector regardless of how they're financed. That's the quantity effect of the deficit. Interest issue bonds or not is about how to set the central bank's interest rate target. Doing MMT, which I don't know what on earth that means. It's not something implementing MMT or doing MMT. These are terms that I've never heard of before. Somebody else who's never read anything we've written started saying. So, even the neoclassical model and operations agree that's not a thing. Krugman and Koshikoda should. So monetary sovereign, here's the key. Here's sort of the core point. A monetary sovereign's ability to print money, what it actually is the ability to incur deficits, however financed, while the interest on the national debt remains policy variable, not something that bond vigilantes come in and attack. That's the core issue. Okay. Okay, so here's another thing for me to add a point. It's really weird that people believe the government running a deficit via overdraft at the central bank is inherently inflationary, but the current system where government runs a deficit and the central bank guarantees the market liquidity for bond dealers to buy government bonds isn't. Let me just say this in English real quick. We generally, the popular view is if the central bank finances a government, that you are violating central bank independence and you are also creating hyperinflation. However, but nobody thinks either of those happen if instead of the central bank directly financing the government, the central bank directly finances financial institutions that then directly finance the government. And that's exactly what we have happened. So, there you go. I don't know, blank stares. That was supposed to be So, some of you might have noticed some stuff went down last week in what they call repo markets. These happen, a couple of things that almost nobody mentioned. These happen to be the markets that those entities called primary dealers that are funding the government auctions of treasuries finance themselves. And notice what happened when the interest rates they had to pay started going up above the Fed's target rate. The Fed came in and said, here's 75 billion, here's 50 billion, etc. Right? So there you see the central bank saying, we're not gonna let interest rates rise for those entities that buy the government bonds. The other thing about that is, notice, this is Bill Dudley, pictures Bill Dudley. Bill Dudley is former New York Fed president. And I like what they say, Fed pressure over funding stress. So how independent is the central bank if it screws up and allows interest rates to rise for the folks that are buying government debt, that are supposed to be buying the government debt, making the market there? If it screws up and allows those interest rates to rise and everybody gets pissed off at them, and they're coming under all kinds of pressure. Yet we have an independent Fed and we're not financing government deficits through the central bank. I'm gonna skip that. Okay, don't add us with your Phillips curve. This will be very quick because I don't have anything to say that probably didn't say. So James Bullard, president of the St. Louis Fed, basically, as Pavlina already said, basically the relationship between unemployment and inflation, which they call the Phillips curve, so add us with the Phillips curve, has gone away. This is the vice chair of the FOMC saying the exact same thing. Inflation appears less responsive to resource slack. So we have some challenges assessing proximity to the labor market to full employment. And then one of the things that kind of started this a couple of years ago was when Trujillo left the Fed and sort of at that time dropped a bomb saying, you know, I was on the Fed and we actually have no idea how inflation is. So don't add us with your MB equals PY, printing money, because mainstream economists, if they know their own model, they say printing money isn't inflationary too. Don't add us with your Phillips curves. If you put unemployment too low, you're just going to get inflation, because central banks around the world, rich countries, don't have any idea how that works. Okay? So the people that are standing behind your critiques of MMT don't agree with you. Okay, don't add us with your low unemployment rates. So why do we disagree with people who think unemployment is really low, so we don't need a job guarantee or whatever? Well, what this graph is showing you is where the people come from who are getting jobs or who are moving into voluntary part-time work. And the blue line down here is the officially unemployed. And you can see above them are two other lines, right? Out of the labor force, not retired, and they said in the survey they don't want a job. And this is some work that we're doing at UMKC with a grad student project, and we've got GISP involved with it, Kyle Moore, Jacob Powell, and Jordan Ayala, and we have a paper that's going to be done very soon putting this together. But what we've got here is the micro data from the survey that the Fed does, or not the Fed, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does every month. 60,000 people each month, something like that. And, you know, we go in and pick out everybody, et cetera, let's go. And so the thing that pops out there to me is that the officially unemployed are far and away not the main people getting jobs, right? It's people who are saying in the survey they don't want a job, and the people who are involuntary part-time, which we kind of include them as that's problematic as well, because they would like to work more at the very least. Okay. Another thing that pops out there is Bill Mitchell did a paper, well, he did a series of papers on an alternative approach to understanding what's going on in the labor market. And Bill was suggesting involuntary part-time, which another word for that is underemployed, suggested they were one of the buffer stocks that gets used by the business sector during recessions, and you can see that's exactly what happened there. Also, a number of people said during the last recession, a lot of people left the labor force and they weren't coming back. And you can see there were a bunch of people that were coming from out of the labor force into jobs and they left, but now they've come back. So again, there were a couple of steps. Bill did this once in his blog, and Randy and Lavia had a piece a few years ago where they argued that the labor force decline was temporary. So we've seen that be validated. Okay. Anyway, this is the exact same data, but what I've done is by percent and stacked it. So the lowest, the bottom one is unemployment. So who's getting jobs? Well, fewer than 1 of every 5 people that gets a job or moves into voluntary part-time is coming from the officially unemployed. So why is unemployment not your indicator of the labor force? Because it's not what's actually happening in the labor markets. Those aren't the people that get the jobs. So what we're doing is we put together an alternative measure, and we call it "Would Take a Job," and that one doesn't roll off the tongue really well, but what we've got is the people who want to work more or want a job, either by their answer in the survey or by their actions in the survey. So if they said, I don't want a job, but next month they have a job, we're saying you want to work. Okay. Or next month they end up in the unemployment line, that sort of thing. Okay. So the green line is those people. Okay. The red line is how many of those people got a job in that month. So what do we do with this in terms of creating maybe an alternative view of unemployment? It's not super easy because it's not, the unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. And what we're pretty much arguing here is both of those are wrong. So you can't just change one number of that and say, oh, there's more unemployed people than you thought. The unemployment rate's really 15% or whatever. Because both are wrong. Okay. So here's one thing that we do. We divide the people who got a job by the people who would take a job. And as you can see there, we've never been better than 33% of the people that want to work getting a job. So don't add us with your low unemployment rate. We're just basically at 33%. And this is a good kind of an indicator that you could use with something like a job guarantee. If you designed a job guarantee and you did it well, this number should get up into the 90s, right? Be the sort of thing you could keep for that kind of. Another thing you do is you can divide them by the number of jobs available. Okay, so the blue line is the number of people who are officially unemployed, and over the last year, for the first time since they started doing this, the number of people who are unemployed officially was fewer than the number of jobs available. So there were 0.82 people who were officially unemployed per job. Doesn't mean they had the same skills or same geographic location, etc. But there you go. At any rate, taking the would take a job minus who got a job, so who's left per job available, we're still at 2.5 people who want a job per job available. Okay, so why do we see this sort of thing happening? Here's a quick thing on how I go through this. For-profit businesses, non-profit businesses, and organizations, state and local governments, no matter how much good they want to do, they are non-profit organizations with a financial survival constraint. That means that, again, no matter how much good they want to do, at some point, the financial survival constraint has to become more important. It has to be someone who doesn't have a financial survival constraint. That's where I'm going with this. So, some of you have heard me talk about this, and I actually went and looked to see if I could find the tweet. It was from 2013. If you can't see it, talk about what they teach you at Harvard Business School. Next one, what they don't teach you at Harvard Business School in the tweet. These two books contain the sum total of all human knowledge. So, keep that in mind. These two policies contain the sum total of all possible choices when there aren't enough jobs for everyone that wants one, which is always. So, the for-profit, non-profit businesses, state, local government, etc., they do not create enough jobs. It's not necessarily their fault, it's by design. They have a financial survival constraint, so people are left over, necessarily. So notice UBI isn't up there, right? That's what Pavlina was getting at. They're not in competition. Even if you get gangs UBI, right, which is basically a poverty level UBI, right? Even if you get that, what are you going to do about somebody who says, I want to work so I can do better than that, but there aren't any jobs? You still have to answer that question. Okay, here's the way we do it though. This is the Fed from 1999. And they don't say it this way anymore, but they mean it the exact same way. They raised interest rates, and they said the pool of available workers willing to take jobs has been drawn down further in recent months. It's a trend that must eventually be contained if inflationary balances are to remain in check. And I think that's just amazing that they can say this and nobody says it. This is the way economists think, right? They say that and they think they're being value free. So, okay. Okay, you like price controls and you cannot lie, so you know you're waiting for this one. Okay, the price level of economic theory doesn't exist. In the real world, it is necessarily a social construction. And I'm going to be super brief here. Nathan Tankis did a fantastic podcast on the money on the left that you should go check out, that spends an hour on this issue. It's fantastic. So I'm going to be really quick. In the real world, here's what happens. Businesses set prices. There's prices being set. I shouldn't say businesses. There's many ways prices are set. Then we get some people at that go out and collect the data, and sometimes they impute price where there aren't prices. And then they weight them, and we end up with a price index. And the change in that price index we call inflation. That's how it works in the real world. If you're going to understand inflation, you got to understand how those prices are set, how they're collected and imputed, and how it's weighted. That's how you understand it. And if you're going to affect inflation, you have to figure out which of those prices and how you're going to affect those. Okay, that's how you do that. That's the real world of price setting and inflation. So this is, I gotta be quick on this. This is a piece by the San Francisco Fed, and a lot of jargon up there. What they're basically saying is 42% of the core price index is pro-cyclical, means it moves with the economy, it moves with unemployment. That would be consistent with those kind of stuff. 58% is not. Notice it's core, so they're leaving out energy and food, which would generally be acyclical as well. Okay, So they're basically saying, well, this might be why the federal school doesn't work, because part of the inflation rate is not coming from things that are responding to the state of the economy. Here's another piece that was looking at the growth rates of different parts of the price index. And you can see they're not correlated, they diverge quite a bit. And you can also see that most of them that are really high are things that were in the acyclical list before. I'm going to show it to you, but just remember there's one or two that aren't. So the nature of prices is inherently legal, regulatory, administered, budgetary. I'm not going to go through all of these because some of them were mentioned already. But basically, hopefully you can look at these and say, yeah, some of those prices generally are not set in free markets like we think they are, right? But they make up a significant part of our price index and our inflation. If you're going to control the inflation rate, this is where you go. I'm just going to mention one that I put down there on the bottom right, involuntary unemployment, which people don't think of. Why would I put involuntary unemployment down there? So when the Fed raises interest rates and tries to get unemployment higher, why is it trying to get unemployment higher?
Price stability.
Inflation, but what? Price stability. Wages. Wages. It's not any just price out there, it's wages. That's why you want more unemployment, right? Involuntary unemployment is the biggest price fix of all time. We don't even think about that, right? In fact, I mean, it's amazing. It's like, well, you know, if you try and keep the pharmaceuticals from price gouging, you're price control, that's socialism. But, you know, if we try and keep wages from growing too fast, that's natural. Right? That's where we are. We don't question that stuff. Quickly, this is like the word. Anyway, basically, the Green New Deal, the core things in there actually will, in the long run, lead to lower and stable inflation. Okay, lastly, who blinks first? So, Pavlina was talking about some of the things where the mainstream has moved in MMT's direction. And we do have to be a little careful because MMT, as Pavlina mentioned, is not the only people that have said a number of these things in the although some of them are. I don't want to go through all of these either. Let's see. Oh, we're good. Okay. So, but I would be remiss if I didn't put up also places where MMT has moved in the neoclassical direction, right? And when that happens, that's exactly what I'll do. But for now, you guys are probably not anyway. Okay. So where will their next blinks come from? I got a list of a number of things. I'm just going to hit a couple of them just to emphasize. Bottom left, the right to a job works with all macro policies. No matter how much fiscal policy or how little fiscal policy, whether you want a UBI or not, et cetera, you always have that choice of what do you do with the people who want jobs and there aren't enough jobs. No matter what other policy proposals you are in favor of, you have to face that choice. And so a job guarantee is compatible with every policy. Bottom right, just because what's going on here, transdisciplinarity, there are no economic problems. There are social problems, there are technological problems, there are environmental problems, there are social, technological, environmental problems, there are not economic problems, and that's why we have the variety of people that we have here. Okay. What we really hope the next blink will be is that they won't say this anymore. We'll do anything to create more jobs and income, except directly create more jobs and income. That's pretty much what happened in the last 10 years. So, then lastly, I put this up here because I want to reemphasize, and some have talked about it already. We really got to be careful that we are not using money as if it actually is a value, right? I mean, how people talk about GDP being problematic, blah, blah, blah. But money isn't the problem with climate change, right? We got to remember that. In the future, if we have climate change, we can still create full employment. There's a lot of stuff to do for the people that are still alive, right? We can create a hell of a lot of GDP with that too, right? So we don't, that's, you know, it's like somebody in the early 1930s saying, I can't wait for World War II because GDP will be so much higher, right? It's not about GDP, it's not about money, obviously. So, MMT isn't about money, and Bottle stole my thunder on this one yesterday. MMT is about putting what's important first and putting money last. Don't at us with MVP, PY, Phyllis Kerr's unemployment as well already as if these are unsettled and uncontroversial. So when somebody starts to talk to you about that stuff, remind them that the people there that they think are backing them up aren't really backing them up. Rethinking inflation unemployment deficits as we're doing isn't crazy, especially if you didn't get everything about them wrong. Asking for a friend. If neoclassicals keep moving in MMT's direction, is it MMT that has the wrong model? We can and we must evaluate socioeconomic, technological, ecological outcomes without putting them in dollar terms.
Good afternoon. I'm super happy to be able to participate and to be part of this panel, and what I really am looking forward to is the discussion that I think is going to follow, that Andres is going to lead. So I don't have any slides, and I really don't have any remarks apart from a few things that I just sort of pecked out while I was sitting here listening to the 3 great presentations that you just heard. And so, you know, this is about MMT in the public sphere, so I'm going to try to make some remarks that are relevant there, and I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Scott and Pavlina and Bill talked about. Bill said, we don't play the game, and I love that, because that really does capture what MMT economists, I think, are all about. We really just don't play the game. You said bullshit. Did you say that out loud? You did. We're trying to articulate how the modern monetary system actually works, right? We're being descriptive. And in doing that, we're pulling back some layers and exposing some truths that make some people very uncomfortable. And once you get certain sort of conditions in place, I mean, as simple as saying, if Warren Mosler were here, he'd say the currency is a simple public monopoly. And then he would say everything else follows from that. So if we can come to terms with what it means to say that the currency is a simple public monopoly, then it's going to lead us to some places that may make us very uncomfortable, not just as economists, but as policymakers and as thinkers who have been telling different stories for a long period of time. And now all of a sudden they're forced to reckon with these new voices who are telling narratives, telling stories, articulating from an economic perspective a different vision of how it all works and what the implications are. And then these guys, I say guys, they're mostly guys, then these guys have to figure out, what am I going to do now? How am I going to continue to tell a story that creates anxiety about the deficit or the national debt, or continues to push politicians to explain how things are going to be paid for in an environment where the layers are being peeled back and people are beginning to recognize that maybe not just the answers that we've been given are wrong, but that we've been asking the wrong questions as well. And so we do try, we go out there, we stick our necks out, we say things that others won't say. They're more comfortable repeating the safe stories, whether it's the simple barter exchange story to try to explain to students where money comes from, how markets are supposed to work, the quantity theory of money, what causes inflation. These are simple models, they're simple stories. People are accustomed to hearing them. We're all in our safe space when we're telling these stories. And then this, rogue group comes and kind of knocks that narrative on its heels, and then you get the inevitable pushback and sometimes name calling, and then things get a little uncomfortable. But I don't know any other way to do this. I didn't know any other way to do this as a young graduate student, starting off at Cambridge University and sitting in the classroom. I know some of you have heard this story, but suffer through it a second time if you have, and if you haven't, this is how I started off. I was a student at Cambridge University, and I was in a classroom with 40 or so other graduate students, and I was listening to Willem Boyder, who is someone that many of you would probably, he went on to become chief economist at Citi, right? But he was a professor at Cambridge University. He was teaching the ISLM model, standard Keynesian sort of stuff. And I had enough of a background, having been a student of Randy Ray's for a period of time, and a student of John Henry's, and I'd read some Minsky and some Keynes and some Marx, and I knew just enough to be dangerous. And what I felt sitting in that classroom was that we weren't getting the full picture, that we were getting a nice, safe story about, how it was all supposed to work. And I thought that we deserved better. I thought we deserved the full story. So I raised my hand and I posed what I thought was a fairly innocuous question. And it had to do with the underlying assumptions in the ISLM model, loanable funds and that sort of stuff. And I pushed him on this point. And his response was to put me back in my place. And he said, in front of all of my peers, as I posed this question, if you are the type of person who wants to talk about money and thinks that money is important, you are probably the same type of person who would enjoy sitting in your basement and beating yourself with a rubber hose. Now, I was just asking a question. So that sent a very clear message to me, that there are certain things one does not discuss, one does not talk about. There's another story that's kind of fun. Do you know the name Bernard Leatier? Leatier? Some of you, what is Bernard Leatier known for? He passed away recently, fairly recently, right? What did he do? What did he do?
Passed away.
Oh, he passed complementary currencies. So you should look into his work. He's a fascinating guy, Belgian economist, right? And Leatier tells this story. You can find this on YouTube. You should go watch this video because it's really quite remarkable. He's talking about MMT and the MMT economists, and he refers to UMKC, and he says, there's this group of economists out there. They say the most incredible things. They're absolutely right. Everything they say is right, he says. But, he said, they're in Siberia. They're in Kansas City. They put them there because they could hide them away, right? They're not allowed to be in departments where respectable economists do respectable economics. They're right? And as he's telling this story, he said he learned a lesson a long time ago, and the lesson was that you never touch the money question. You never touch the money question. And he said he was a student, a graduate student at MIT. Guess who he was in school with? Paul Krugman. So they were contemporaries, right, in graduate school. And he said that he, Leatier, had this interest in money. He wanted to talk about money like I did at Cambridge. He dared to bring up money. And Krugman said, this is his story, right? So I'm telling it the way he told it. He said that Paul Krugman told him, didn't they tell you? And Bernard said, tell me what? You never touch the money question. Not if you want to go on to do something respectable, right? If you want to go on to have influence as an economist coming out of MMT, you're not going to go there. That'll get you into trouble. And what do? Well, Scott says MMT is not about money, but it's not about printing money. Certainly, we've got the currency is a simple public monopoly. We start with that, okay? We start with questions of currency. So automatically, that puts us sort of, in a different category from most of the mainstream in terms of the way that we think and talk about finance and banking and money. For, the people who missed the crisis, it was no great surprise that so many working economists didn't see the financial crisis coming because there was no room for what in their model? Money, banks, finance, debt, right? All of those things. Defaults, fraud, right? Some of these little things that happen sometimes in the real world. So, we do say these things. We don't shy away from them. We just embrace them because we're trying to understand the world around us. We're trying to help articulate a narrative that helps others better understand the world around them and to get us in a position where ultimately we get better public policy as a result. So Bill has for years referred to these sorts of positions, taking these positions as career-limiting gestures. And that's what Bernard meant by saying UMKC, that we had limited our careers by holding these views, articulating these views, and they're not going to invite us to come to Princeton and to Harvard and to give job talks and to recruit us, away from where we are. And then we think that's okay. We get ridiculed. They call us voodoo economics, right? Dangerous ideas and all of that sort of stuff. I think we're actually pretty useful to the mainstream establishment economists. Why? Because we take views that they can call extreme, allowing them to take slightly more aggressive views on things and still appear moderate, right? In the center, respectable. So we've pushed them, and I think that, what you've seen in Scott's presentation is that we're having an impact on the discourse, both in the policy sphere and within the economic field, within the economic discipline. And I think that that's incredible, what we're beginning to achieve after all of these years. So I'll just say very quickly, we've pushed the people that Warren would refer to as the headline progressives to take positions that they didn't hold 10 years ago or 5 years ago or sometimes a year ago. The debt crisis. People who were writing about the possibility of the US ending up like Greece are no longer saying that. They've changed their views. And I don't think that there's any doubt that the reason that their views changed is because they gained a better understanding of what makes the US different from Greece because of our contributions. I don't think that there's any way around that. People like Paul Krugman, who were writing about the US potentially ending up like Greece, now say that's a crazy thing to suggest, that it just won't happen. When it comes to debt sustainability, Scott has written some of the most important papers from the MMT perspective in the literature about what it means to say fiscal sustainability, or debt sustainability. And here comes Olivier Blanchard, January of this year, at the AEA presidential address. He delivers remarks that shift the policy discussion almost overnight. What does he do? He gets up and says, actually, it appears that the debt is not on an unsustainable trajectory, given the relationship between interest rates and growth rates for the last 3 decades. It is reasonable to expect that the near term will look much like the recent past, and therefore, we could probably sustain not just trillion-dollar deficits, but perhaps even larger ones. Maybe the debt ratio could even double, and we'd be okay. Shivers. Now everyone went, what? Because it was Olivier Blanchard, right? He wrote the macro textbook that I used as a student at Cambridge, okay? This is an influential voice. But Scott wrote that paper 5 years before he did. Almost the exact same paper, right? Scott gets there for better reasons because he has a different understanding of how the interest rate is actually set. But so much of what Blanchard does in that paper was preempted by Scott by many, many years. So I think we're having my phone keeps dying, there's where my notes are. The role of taxes. Look, MMT is the only game in town when it comes to just a full-throated, candid narrative about the role of taxes at the federal level. Nobody else says what we say. And this has been a hard one, and this scares the hell out of people in policy circles, right? Because their whole game is figuring out how to achieve pay-fors, to get legislation passed, and so taxes are the key, right? You need revenue. Treating government taxation as revenue, as the thing that pays for our bridges and roads and military and all that kind of stuff, that's not a story, that's not a narrative that people are looking to give up. Both in the Beltway circles, where I was for a period of time, and in academia. The one person I can say who, I was very surprised when he did it, who has openly embraced the MMT line on this is, does anyone know? One of these people that Warren would call a headline progressive. No, it wasn't DeLong. Oh, thanks, what's that for? Oh, thank you. It's just that it goes to sleep when I stop touching it, but thank you for that. It was Dean Baker. It was Dean Baker. And so, but that's a signaling device, right? When Dean pens a piece like that and uses the description that we've used, it's important. It helps move things a little bit. Fiscal space, the way that we talk about fiscal space, the way that we talk about the capacity of the economy to absorb new spending without the need for offsets, provided that there is fiscal space, meaning that it won't generate an acceleration in inflation, right? You can do this. Who's now using language like that? People like Jared Bernstein. He's talking about fiscal space in a way that is extremely close to the way that we're talking about it. And so now he started saying things like, it's perceived fiscal space that holds us back. It's the perception in the minds of lawmakers that there's no space, because the budget is $1 trillion, because the national debt is 22 or 16, however you want to count it. So what we need to do is get over the perception that there's no fiscal space, because he's saying, there actually is. So I think that's progress as well. God, this is annoying. On printing money and the monetary transmission mechanism, did you hear Draghi's remarks last week? So he wasn't even asked about MMT. Powell was asked about MMT. Kuroda was asked about MMT. Janet Yellen was asked about MMT. The question gets posed, but with Draghi, he just invoked it on his own, right? He's there, he's I don't know if it was a press conference or what it was, but he said there are new ideas out there, like modern monetary theory, and we should be thinking and looking more closely at some of these sort of things. So I think that a lot of progress has been made. I did a debate, a year or so ago with Noah Smith. We debated in the pages of Bloomberg on deficits, and we just had a back and forth exchange. And we published it, and it got a lot of attention. And the name has come up twice, Coach Lakota. So Narana Coach Lakota was the head of the Minneapolis Fed for a period of time, and he now is a contributor to Bloomberg Opinion. And I'm just going to say this, I've never said this publicly, but what the hell. He sent an email after the debate with Noah, and he sent it to both of us, okay? So I'm not we all know this to be the case. And he said, MMT has amassed a better track record when it comes to predictability, the best in all of macroeconomics, he said. No school of thought comes close over the last 20 years. But, he said, that doesn't mean the next 20 will look the same. So I replied, you're right, but I like the odds. So the point is that people are seeing it. They're seeing the track record, the literature is there. So much of what we've written has been made accessible to everyone, so it's become difficult to ignore. People who are open-minded enough to wrestle with new ideas without being so reactionary that you just label them voodoo, call it printing money, and go straight to Zimbabwe. There are decent intellectual people out there who will take new ideas seriously, who don't think they already have all the answers. And it's been fun to engage with those people. And I had a long back and forth with Olivier Blanchard. I won't continue to name names, but there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that you all don't know, but it's important that the work is being respected in ways that I think should make us all proud. And we can't always put that out there publicly, but you know, I want to give you a teaser so that you know you're part of something that's important and that we are continuing to progress. So, I don't know, I want to say something about the Senate resolution because somebody brought it up, but the idea that MMT is now being invoked by people like AOC, like Sunrise or the Green New Deal, that there are references being made to our work in the context of taking on the fossil fuel industry, that is shaking people up a lot. It's making them nervous, and to the extent that they view MMT as something that is going to help pave the way to get us to a Green New Deal or something like that, it's very disconcerting. And so when I showed up to record a podcast with Chris Hayes, I don't know, 4 months or something ago, I walked in and he's sitting there in the studio and he's on his phone. And he looks up at me and he says, so 5 Republican senators condemned MMT. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, 5 senators have just had a resolution condemning MMT in the US Senate. And I said, Chris, I mean, I think he's winding me up, you know, I didn't know. And he turned to the phone and said, no, look, I couldn't believe it, right? The idea that this is the public sphere. And this is where we have, I think, the biggest challenges ahead of us now are figuring out how to, in a sense, operationalize these insights. So how do we get lawmakers to drop this pay-for nonsense, to stop the silly game, and to transform the federal budgeting process in a way that is no longer paying homage to an arbitrary, artificial revenue constraint, but replacing it with a real inflation constraint, which is what we've wanted from the very beginning. And the last thing I'm going to say is that progress is being made there too. I'm not going to be in a position to say that a lot more, but you should know that there are people in the House and in the Senate, both elected members of Congress and their very smart staffers, who are starting to think in a really different way about the nature of the feedback that they seek when they want to send a bill to CBO. Instead of saying, we want to do infrastructure, here's our pay for, tell us if it's going to add to the deficit. They're starting to understand that this is a phony game and that the right way to proceed is to say, this is the spending bill, these are the offsets we're proposing, please let us know if we have adequately mitigated inflation risk. And that's truly progress in terms of, you know, the policy sphere, the public sphere. So that's it. I just wanted to say it.
I want another round of applause for our panelists. That was we can open it up now to a discussion, but I want to say a couple words. You know, I have a couple friends here who I know from a really, really long time ago, who was their second year here at the MMT conference, and we were both, or the three of us, were trained in a leadership school where we met Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and one of the things that we were taught that I think really represents a strong affinity that I feel with MMT is this sense that, you know, we refuse to kind of let them tell us to stay in your place, and when they don't invite us to the party, we just create a better party and invite all the cool people. And, you know, I feel that that's something that MMT does pretty great, so. So, okay, in terms of the public sphere and the conversation, you know, we have the media, we have academia, government, and kind of all of these activist spaces, and you know, I think many of us, and especially you all, have been able to be in all of these different avenues. So I'm wondering to hear from you all how in this last year, where it seems as though MMT has really got into this new place, what are those avenues looking like? What are there any new ones that have emerged? Is the conversation in the public kind of moving in different directions, or is social media becoming a large place? How should we understand that at this point? Yeah, I'll repeat the question. I mean, okay, so
like a congressional hearing.
You know, you all have been able to be amongst many politicians and governments and in academia and with activists. So those are just different vantage points about where the public discourse is right now. So, you know, with all of the growth and the visibility that MMT now has, what are the new avenues that are opening up? I mean, should we consider growth in academia in terms of the economics of the discipline, or is it really happening at the activist field? Which ones are moving the ball forward the most?
That's not the.
Yeah.
That one. Or not.
Can we get some mics here? That mic isn't working.
There it goes.
How do you like it so far?
Really good. Yeah, that works.
Just a simple comment. I have found that there has always been interest from our friends from the international community, especially in Europe, Italy, Spain, Austria. But I have also found that there's an increasing appetite from different corners of the world to talk to us and to kind of galvanize a progressive wave in their own corners of the world, from France to Belgium to Argentina to Australia, and I think that you know, we have a lot more to do to develop these global networks. It takes a lot of work, but I think that's where we need to spend our efforts to not be sort of siloed in our networks in New York, in our networks in Madrid, and like we have such a common project, such a human project, and so there is an interest out there, and we just need to be able to reach out and then advance these ideas at the policy level. So that's one thing that I've noticed. There's appetite and there's greater interest. There are also some odd things that are happening, like the Harvard Kennedy School is running an MMT workshop. And I don't know if you know the professor, I didn't know. And what is he assigning? What is he discussing? Did you know? Yeah?
It's bullshit. He's the former chief economist at Standard & Poor's credit rating.
Okay, so it's so fantastic. It's taken a life of its own. So it's a genuine, Yep. So maybe, maybe Stephanie can talk about it, but what I'm noticing is that we get these surprise, like, pieces of information that people are interested in these ideas completely separate from our community. And they are taking them, they're discussing them behind closed doors, whether they're investors who are writing memos to their constituents. I think that has been a bigger development in the last year than we have seen previously. Again, their academic departments. I keep thinking that, it's so wonderful that we have the textbook, but without our students, we really can't democratize this knowledge. I love our activists. They have done more than I could have ever imagined for this project, but we also have to develop the pedagogy with the research program. And so in this sense, it's not going to come from departments like mine. It's not going to come from elite colleges. Like, we have to democratize the MMT message in the community colleges, in the public universities, and it's just a call, like an invitation to people who are interested in that sort of thing to do that work.
Bill, I have a question for you. So when we speak about fraud, it seems like that in and of itself is such a socially constructed idea as well, and where we draw the lines on what fraud is and isn't seems to be up to the public or who has the power to do so. Do you feel like what we consider fraud, the frame through which we consider fraud, is at the right point, or is this something that we should expand to truly get at what the kind of behavior that's happening?
So some economists are finally taking predation seriously. Neoclassical stuff is the exact opposite. The ruthless consumer that has all power, and industry is helpless in the hands of us as consumers. Criminology, for decades, wouldn't talk about predation because if it's not called a crime, how dare we, study it? And a bunch of us are pushing to try to get over that. And to get to the point, predation is often more dangerous than fraud, because predation means you've got enough political juice that you've been able to get what you do declared legal, right? So we see both of them as having extensive overlap. There's also a technical answer to your question. The Supreme Court has been making it tougher and tougher to get convictions against elite fraudsters and for corruption in particular. All of that, in our jargon, makes the world much more criminogenic. In other words, a place where you're going to have a lot of crime. And so I think one of the other things is that, in part because of the history, everybody associated with UMKC takes institutions as an important thing and thinks in terms of the influence of institutions, the incentive structures they create, but beyond that, the humanity or destruction of humanity that it creates. So that we also have thought of as an advantage of the, what do they call us, the Siberia?
Yeah. So, along those same lines, I think conventionally MMT is often thought of as a macro theory in focusing on money, but one of the things I heard from presentations is kind of insights into a theory that's much more than just a macro analysis, but really challenging the entire notion that supply and demand and markets is what dictates prices. Where is that alignment now between the insights of modern MMT's macro ideas and some sorts of micro foundations?
You took the mic. I know.
Okay, so micro foundations, which is
right. Yes, because you mentioned prices, and so I think it's
oh gosh, I have no organized answers to that. It's shocking, I know. But in the discussion of the price index, there's obviously a connection there. Well, let me say first off, Fred Lee was the first guy to start doing this. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're diving into Fred Lee. Fred Lee was, I don't know if there are any other microeconomists that try to integrate what they were doing. Anyway, I know. I don't have both sides. I mean, it's a great question. Bill? Sure.
So it's one of the bridges that Stephanie is talking about, where you have the neoclassical moving much more in our direction is also occurring on the micro side. So you have the Asreas of the world. Again, to situate them, this is a very conservative, modern macro, in jargon, freshwater kind of person. So the most extreme version of it. And he's saying, the two things we really, really, really need to be able to deal with are asymmetrical information and the fact that people don't always repay loans, right? And we were not joking. The models of modern macro that were in use, I mean, there were some exceptions, but the ones they actually used had no possibility. You literally couldn't default in their model. And you can imagine how much difficulty they had explaining bank failures. And it turns out, I know this is shocking, but financial crises turn out to have a lot to do with really severe recessions, like historically, and for understandable reasons. And if you don't understand the micro aspects of them, then you create a macro model that's insane, right? That literally, actually Bugut has said, it isn't that the models give us the wrong answer, it's they don't even allow us to ask the right questions, to quote him. And then he used the rubber hose one again, and said, and they took the rubber hoses out, they being the modern macro folks, and beat the nonlinearities out of all of their models as well. So yes, this is another area where it turns out fraud and predation are enormously important to whether you have financial catastrophes. That is a classic micro foundation. We now have the other side saying, yes, those things are really important, but they have absolutely no tools. They have no Fred Lee, right? And they could look forever and they never find Fred type of thing, because that's not the journals they would ever read. So yeah, that's an important area of development right now.
We get a round of questions. Yeah, quick questions. Back there. No, you.
Really quick. So yeah, real quick. Explain Argentina and what's going on.
Explain Argentina and what's going on, because someone just said MMT has an Argentina problem.
We'll take a bunch and then we can answer it.
Okay.
Back there.
Question for Professor Black. So, obviously we had the financial crisis, the mortgage meltdown, regulators saying now that banks are full of capital and liquidity, they're not funding themselves in wholesale markets with this collateral. Where do you think we should be shining the spotlight now?
Okay, one more.
Yeah, MMT presents itself as a normatively neutral, descriptive social science.
MMT presents itself
as a descriptive social science theory. As it is now getting perhaps looked at by other members of the Economic Academy, are you going to find it being used by people who have completely different commitments? For example, in one of the sessions I was at today, someone was suggesting that China is employing MMT theory, that it can be employed, of course, by regimes in any ideological stripe. Is there any intrinsic connection between MMT theory and the social rights agenda that most of you propound?
It's about your last question to the table. Michael Kalinsky and Joseph Steiner, they work together, micro and macro, in the heterodox perspective.
Mike, will you talk about Argentina?
Okay.
Say who you are.
Okay, my name is Mike Fullwiler. I'm an economist. I have a background in finance and worked briefly at the IMF. I worked at Freddie Mac. I have a blog which is feldmaneconomics.com. Called feldmaneconomics.blogspot.com. So I can talk briefly about Argentina. Argentina was on a fixed exchange rate until 2015, at which point the current president, Mauricio Macri, won the election, was close, and immediately allowed the currency to float. That attracted, the currency wasn't being artificially overvalued. Flotation means it's a market determined exchange rate. And there was a lot of money from international investors that went into Argentina thinking that, oh, there's a new sheriff in town, everything's going to be great. So, from 2016 to 2018, the Argentine stock market almost tripled. I think the U.S. did pretty well, but not well. Argentina was able to issue a 100-year bond and $100 million. This is a country that 15 years ago defaulted. And then some of his policies that were conservative and really cut back on a lot of social spending became very clear that with those kind of policies, he was going to have a very hard time being reelected. And so lots of people started moving out of Argentine financial assets, and that caused the currency to start to depreciate. And one of the big problems that the Central Bank of Argentina faced is they were never really able to decouple the exchange rate from the rate of inflation. And so then they started trying to raise interest rates a bunch and still didn't fix inflation because the main problem was political and not economic. That just people didn't want to hold Argentine assets because of political uncertainty. And I guess I don't really see where MMT enters into the equation. The central bank did the exact traditional mainstream view to try to contain inflation, which was to raise interest rates through the roof, and through the roof, I mean 60–70%. Then even tried, I don't want to get too far in the weeds of central bank operations, but they even tried one of the same strategies that Paul Volcker implemented in the United States, which was just fixing the monetary base, and even that has not worked. So I don't really see the connection, especially if you go back to don't add what Scott said, but don't add us with our MV or the quantity of money theory stuff. If you have a central bank fixing the quantity of money and it's still not going to deliver inflation problem, and they're gonna say that is the big debunk of MMT. You know, I guess, I don't know if that's really worthy of a response. That's Argentina in a nutshell.
So, in more general terms, this is kind of indicative of what's happening. When Rich asked the question, the first question asked was about so what's changing, etc. And what's happening is I know which speech you're talking about in Argentina, and it basically just gets lumped in with everything else that's coming out of people that think they know MMT because they read somebody else who talked about MMT, and none of them actually have ever read anything by MMT. And it's pretty deliberate by the mainstream as well, because they really want us to go away. And the way to make us go away is to pretend like we're not serious, or to not take us seriously. And the way in academics you don't take somebody seriously is to criticize them without citing, demonstrating that you've actually read something by them. So, I mean, MMT doesn't have an Argentina problem. Argentina has an MMT problem. It's way worse. I mean, the earliest literature in the mid-90s was saying basic things about what a monetary sovereign is, and Argentina violates almost all of it. So the advice to Argentina would never get from MMT what Argentina actually did.
Yeah. I'm not sure I heard it fully, but here's the key scoop on capital. We have a capital-centric regime of how we regulate banks, particularly in the prompt corrective action statute. And we've forgotten this small little thing called accounting. And that all frauds virtually that are sophisticated operate through accounting. Assets minus liabilities equal capital. So if I overstate assets, understate liabilities, or all of the above, I get fictional capital. And so they created this statute back in 1991, said, boy, we've got prompt corrective action, we don't need no stinking regulators now, because we mandated closure at 1.5% capital. That's what they do. And on average, the institution is insolvent by 22%. When they get 1.5% reported capital. So we have a system that relies on non-existence of fraud to deal with the real world in which accounting fraud is essentially everything.
Richard, I think if I understood your question was, what about the normative aspects of MMT? And can MMT be, you said applied, which is really like my red flag. Like there are the prescriptions, right? So the policy prescriptions, so MMT explains the monetary systems, and clearly countries like China are employing the power of the public purse for their very specific economic objectives. And so I think that the MMT project is naturally wedded to a rights framework for guaranteeing basic economic rights and economic security. Certainly the power of the state, the public purse, is continually used for other ends that do not guarantee basic economic rights. So I don't have any answer to this except this is a battle of ideas, it's a battle of goals and objectives, and we need to wrestle back our understanding of the public purse so that we can fight this battle better.
The bad guys already know this. They've known it for hundreds of years, they've used it for hundreds of years. You want unilateral disarmament? Whenever the good people are in charge, they need to be able to use this as well. We can't stop the bad guys from doing it. There's no way to do that, so we focus on what we can achieve.
I mean, look what the Labour Party did in the UK. Look at the austerity. And now Boris comes in, what does he say he's going to do? Start spending. The end of austerity. Declares the end of austerity. So, and then we didn't do that, right? But as Bill says, they know that that was self-imposed gratuitous suffering. And so, you know, we provide the lens, we provide a better description of how it all works, and it's out there in the public domain. So if there's a right-wing government that grabs on to the insights and starts applying that thinking to ends that you and I would not find desirable, are we to blame for that, or is there some way we can intervene or prevent it? We can't, right? We can't. I mean, if there's a smallpox vaccine and a right-wing government and a left-wing government have access to it and can improve conditions in the domestic population, they're both going to presumably be drawn to this. I think the goal is to get the ideas out there so that what we have today is an unlevel playing field. There's asymmetric information. As Bill said, they already know. Congress already knows that if it wants to put $727 billion into the Defense Reauthorization Act, all they have to do is raise their hands and vote, and it's done. They know that. So they must also know that they can do it for education, or for infrastructure, or for anything else. The problem is that we don't all know that. And so the information is asymmetric, and what we're trying to do is, in a sense, you know, it's an educational project. We're trying to get people better informed so that we can level the playing field in terms of the understanding, so that we can hold them accountable when resources are denied in the face of human suffering that could be easily eliminated, but it isn't, because they're in a position to tell us we can't because we can't afford it.
They want an infinite series of Sophie's Choice. You choose which of those social programs to chop. And then we'll come back next month and we'll make you choose between two more and two more and two more. And then we're gonna write nonsense, or, you know, like Chris Matthews, about how they saved Social Security by cutting it. You know, so they tell this story, but maybe Matthews believes it because he's a very, very little brain, but nobody else believes it.
I'll add one more thing to that as well. I mean, when we think about whether a right-wing government or a left-wing government understands these insights, I mean, once you know something, I mean, you still have to do something with that knowledge. And when we, you know, think about Boris in the UK or Trump here in the United States using spending, I mean, people suffer. Very particular kinds of people are the ones that suffer from that, you know. So understanding something is just the beginning of a larger process of what kind of society do we want, you know. And so that's, you know, that's my take on that. You know, do we want to respect and give dignity to everybody, or do we want to use these insights just to, you know, create a very exclusive, small little circle, which is what we have already? So what's the difference? So that's what I think that's everything, so thank you, everybody. And thank you for your attendance.
A matter of quick housekeeping. Tomorrow the workshops will still be in the Wang Centre. The public forum will be in here from 9 till 12. So there's the public forum is where the breakfast is here, and then the individual workshops will be in the other room. There'll also be a giveaway probably during lunch for the few MMT textbooks we have, given that the topic there is about the research paradigm that seems appropriate at that point. We're going to get some food now. As we do that, we need to actually put some tablecloths on the tables. So if you could please make sure that any computers and things are on the table so we can get them set up, that'd be great.
We have the live streams now. No problem.